Judith was born about 600 years before Jesus Christ and lived in a city called Bethulia. She was the widow of a man named Manasseh, who was very wealthy but died from sunstroke while harvesting barley. Manasseh left Judith a great fortune, which she used to live in her palace with her maidservants. She dedicated her life to prayer and fasting. At that time, a king named Nebuchadnezzar ruled over the Assyrian Empire. He sought to dominate the entire world and force all nations to worship him as a god. In the 12th year of his reign, he waged war against King Arphaxad of the Medes. It was a massive battle, and Nebuchadnezzar sent messengers to all the kingdoms under his rule, calling them to join his army. However, no one responded. Everyone saw him as arrogant and oppressive. Enraged, Nebuchadnezzar ordered his general, Holofernes, to assemble a vast army and subdue all the kingdoms that refused to obey him. The army consisted of 120,000 soldiers and 1,000 cavalrymen, along with an enormous number of camels, livestock, and supplies. Nebuchadnezzar didn't wait long. He personally assembled his army and marched toward Arphaxad's kingdom with an enormous force. The battle was fierce, but in the end, Nebuchadnezzar emerged victorious. Nebuchadnezzar killed Arphaxad and took control of his city, Ecbatana. After this victory, he saw himself as the god of the entire earth and demanded absolute submission. Since the kingdoms that had ignored his call earlier still refused to acknowledge him, he decided to take revenge on them one by one. This marked the real threat to the people of Israel, because this king was not playing around. This is where one of the most important figures in the story appears: Holofernes, Nebuchadnezzar's army commander. This man was a true beast, merciless and ruthless. Nebuchadnezzar summoned him and said, "Listen, Holofernes, I don't want a single kingdom standing against me. Wipe them off the face of the earth. Make anyone who dares resist us an example." Holofernes assembled a terrifying army, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, cavalry, war chariots, and weapons capable of leveling entire cities. He set out from Nineveh, and every city he encountered had two choices: surrender and bow at his feet, or be burned to the ground and erased from existence. The surrounding kingdoms were terrified. They had heard of the unstoppable army marching toward them. Some surrendered immediately, while others tried to resist, only to be crushed beneath the feet of Nebuchadnezzar's forces. Holofernes continued his ruthless conquest, city after city, until he finally approached the land of the Israelites. As soon as the kings and rulers heard what had happened to the cities that had tried to resist, they knew that facing Holofernes meant certain death. So, they decided not to take any chances. Many of them sent messengers to Holofernes, carrying letters of surrender. "We are your servants. We will do whatever you command. Just let us live." The messengers arrived at Holofernes' camp and met the arrogant general. They said, "We are the kings of the cities near you, and we have decided to surrender before you even think of attacking us. Our homes, our fields, everything we have is yours. Just promise us that you won't destroy us." Holofernes knew that Nebuchadnezzar didn't just want people to submit out of fear. He wanted them to acknowledge him as the only god on earth. So, he told them, "Fine, I accept your surrender. But from this moment on, you have only one king, Nebuchadnezzar. Forget your gods and worship him alone." The people agreed immediately, not because they believed in him, but because they were terrified. Holofernes entered their cities, took control of their resources, and completely subdued them. The army kept moving from city to city until they finally reached the borders of Israel. This was where the real danger began. Israel faces the unknown. The people of Jerusalem and the Jewish cities knew that their turn was coming, and that Holofernes' army was ruthless. Fear filled their hearts, but at the same time, they had faith that God would not abandon them in this battle. As soon as the Israelites heard that Holofernes was approaching, they gathered together and made a decision. They would never surrender, no matter what. They knew that facing the Assyrian army was no easy task, and that they were weaker militarily, but they had a weapon far greater than any army: faith. The first thing they did was send messages to all the Jewish towns and villages, urging them to prepare for a siege. They blocked all roads, fortified the mountains and cities, and stored food and water in anticipation of an attack. Then, the priests and the entire people of Jerusalem gathered together, put on sackcloth, fasted, and prayed fervently, begging God for protection. The high priests offered sacrifices and went up to the temple, weeping before the Ark of the Covenant, pleading for God's mercy. Women and children also joined in prayer. The entire scene was filled with both fear and reverence, but at the same time, there was a deep certainty that God would not leave them to face this battle alone. When Holofernes saw that the Israelites were prepared for the siege and showed no fear, he was shocked. How could this small nation dare to stand against the mighty Assyrian army that had already crushed cities far stronger than them? He decided to learn more about them before launching his attack. He summoned one of his commanders, Achior, the leader of the Ammonites, and asked him, "Who are these people? What's their story? And why are they so confident?" Achior knew the history of the Israelites well, so he began to explain. "These people are not like any other nation. They are descendants of those who migrated from the land of the Chaldeans and later lived in Egypt for many years. There, they were enslaved, but their God performed great miracles for them. He freed them from Pharaoh, parted the Red Sea for them, and gave them the land of Canaan. They have defeated every nation that stood in their way." Holofernes listened carefully as Achior continued. "Their strength does not come from their army, but from their God. As long as they remain faithful to Him, no one can defeat them. But if they sin and disobey His commandments, He abandons them, and they become easy to conquer." Holofernes was furious. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. How dare someone suggest that there was a God more powerful than Nebuchadnezzar? Enraged, he shouted at Achior, "Are you saying they could defeat me? I will crush them and show all nations that Nebuchadnezzar is the only God." But instead of killing Achior, Holofernes came up with a cunning plan. He ordered his soldiers to untie him up and leave him at the gates of the Israelite city, as if sending a message. "Take your man back, but you won't be safe for long." The Israelites found Achior and listened to what he had to say about Holofernes' evil plans. Instead of being afraid, his words only strengthened their faith even more. They realized that this battle would not be won by weapons alone, but by the power that comes from God. Holofernes and his massive army finally reached the borders of Weka. Bethulia, the last obstacle in his path. He stood atop the mountain, looking down at the small city, protected only by its walls. With a mocking smile, he turned to his commanders and said, "What kind of wall do they think will protect them from my army? They'll stay inside until they die of hunger and thirst." He ordered his troops to surround the city from all sides. His army was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, war chariots and tents covering the land around Bethulia. When the people inside the city looked out from the walls, all they could see was an endless sea of soldiers and war machines. The Edomite and Moabite leaders approached Holofernes and said, "We know these people well. They won't surrender easily. Their God has taught them patience. Instead of attacking them, let's cut off their water supply. The city gets its water from springs at the foot of the mountain. If we control them, they'll surrender on their own." Holofernes liked the idea. He sent his troops to block every source of water leading to the city. Soon, Thirst spread among the people of Bethulia, and they began to collapse one by one. Within days, desperation took over. Children cried from thirst, men grew weaker, and the entire city was on the brink of breaking down. The elders of the city gathered and went to their leader, Uzziah, pleading, "We can't endure this any longer. Surrender the city before we all die." But despite his deep sorrow for his people, Uzziah responded, "Hold on for 5 more days. Maybe the Lord will work a miracle and save us." In the midst of a suffering and weakness, in Bethulia, a woman emerged. Judith, the beautiful and devout widow, known for her wisdom and unwavering faith in God. When she heard that the people of the city were losing hope and considering surrender, she was deeply saddened and knew she had to act. She called for the city's elders, and when they gathered at her home, she stood before them with firm determination and said, "How can you doubt the power of the Lord? How dare you put him on a deadline saying, 'You have 5 days to save us'? We have no right to dictate time to God. His wisdom is far greater than ours." Uzziah and the elders were astonished by her unshakable faith. But Judith wasn't just speaking. She had a plan. She looked them in the eyes and declared, "I have a strategy, and the Lord will deliver us from Holofernes and his army. But you must let me act freely and not ask me what I'm going to do." Uzziah, though hesitant, agreed to her request, but couldn't hide his concern. He looked at her and said, "Do what the Lord has placed in your heart, but do not put yourself in danger." She entered her chamber, fasted, and prayed to God. Then she rose, bathed, and dressed in her finest clothes, adorning herself with the most beautiful jewelry and perfumes. She looked so stunning that everyone who saw her from her people was astonished by her beauty. After that, she left the city with her maid and headed to the camp of Holofernes' army. As soon as the soldiers saw her, they were mesmerized by her beauty. When they asked her why she had come, she told them that she had fled from her people because they were dying of thirst and that she had valuable information that would help Holofernes enter the city easily. The soldiers took her to Holofernes. The moment he saw her, he was deeply struck by her beauty and immediately drawn to her. He asked her about her plan, and she told him that she would inform him of the right time to attack once she noticed that her people had completely weakened. Holofernes believed her and allowed her to stay in the camp. Every day, she would go out to pray in front of her tent, which only made them trust her even more. After 4 days, Holofernes held a banquet and invited Judith. He drank excessively and became completely drunk. When he went into his tent to sleep, she followed him, and his sword was with him. Judith took the sword with all her strength and struck Holofernes on the neck, cutting off his head. Then she placed his head in a bag, took her maid, and they both left the camp. Judith returned to Bethulia, and as soon as they arrived, she revealed Holofernes' head to the people. When the enemy soldiers saw that their commander had been killed, they were shocked and began to flee. The men of Bethulia then rushed out, attacked them, and easily defeated them. Thanks to Judith's courage and faith, the city was liberated, and her name became a symbol of heroism in the history of her people. She lived in piety until she passed away at the age of 105,